I challenged myself to complete a sketch every day for 30 days straight. Now, when I say complete a sketch, I mean that if I wanted to lay down some line art and render it, it's fully ready for me to do so. Since it's only 30 pieces, I'm going to briefly go over each one and note something that I like about it, and something that I don't like, since none of these pieces are great, but some, by my own personal standards, I would say are pretty good. Before we start, I want to begin by showing a couple of the pieces I've done, as well as share a very brief history of my journey with art. I decided to try and be consistent with my art in the beginning of 2020 when the pandemic's lockdowns first started, and you can see a couple of my attempts here. After I burnt myself out of trying to complete one of these every day, which, believe it or not, took me like 5 hours at the time, I ended up slowing down and trying to do a piece a month, which were also mediocre since I never really tried to learn anything fundamental. There's definitely some improvement, but when you're starting from near zero, it's kinda hard not to improve. And I think that I wanted shortcuts more than I actually wanted to organically improve. Fast forward 2 years to 2022, and I've been really on and off with art, but here are a few pieces that I did. Jett, Sage, and Killjoy from Valorant. The Jett one was first, and at the time I thought that I caught lightning in a bottle with the facial expression. But look anywhere beyond that, and none of the lines really have any conviction or purpose. They're very scratchy and without intention, and instead look really unconfident, something that I would say was just my style at the time, and something that you'll see I still struggle with. With the Killjoy piece, the facial construction's very poor, especially with her left eye, and the whole thing really just falls apart. Also, the colors and blending that I used look really messy, and at the same time almost dirty since I had no clue how to layer or blend, or what a multiply layer was. With the Sage piece, I accidentally made her look like a monkey since I had no clue how facial construction should work. So her nose is too long, meaning her mouth is too low, and I also placed the mouth too low relative to the ratio between the nose and the chin, which altogether just makes her face look really off. Also with these, you'll notice they're only chest up, partially because my reference photos only showed that much, but more so because I only chose reference photos that were from the chest up, because I didn't know how and was too scared to learn how to draw full bodies. Funnily enough, I never posted these until like late last month just to have them online, and the official Valorant Twitter account liked and commented on it, so just this once. Thank you, Riot. It's also worth noting that, while I never really finished anything between the Valorant art and the challenge, I made some attempts to learn proportions and anatomy, which you can see here. Nothing too complex, of course, but I think it's important to let you know that I didn't suddenly learn how to draw a body just by starting the challenge. So, now that you've seen where I began with art and where I was, it's probably about time for me to get to the actual challenge and my progress throughout each day. Since I was so fixated on trying to get a sketch done every day, I really just lifted references from Pinterest and tried to redraw them in my own style. So you might recognize the references I've used from other, more popular artists who've done the same. Starting with day 1, I just finished catching up with Oshinoko, and since I don't read manga too often, I always get really inspired to draw when I do. So the first few pieces are going to be based on that. Here, you can see that I drew 3 of the girls from the show, and I was just generally happy to see that I could somewhat replicate the human form without too much difficulty. Although, the poses are very stiff and simple, with some very glaring flaws, and nothing really interesting about it. For day 2, I drew Kana from the show with an umbrella. While I think it's cute and the umbrella actually looks pretty nice, the perspective around her arms is wonky, her hands are too small, and the overall piece looks really flat. Also, this took me almost 2 hours despite how simple everything about it is. For day 3, I did Aqua from Oshinoko in a cardigan. Honestly, looking back on it, I don't really like too much about this one. The shoulder's really out of place, and you can tell I was unconfident with the torso shape by my excessively light shading on the clothes. Day 4, I drew Akane from the series, and I promise this is the last Oshinoko drawing that I did. I started using drop shadows here to sort of anchor the subject to the background, and I kinda like the pose here. That being said, what was I thinking with the shirt? Like, there's no flow or shape language here, and it feels like it just sort of exists on her torso. Also, I didn't bother actually doing anything with the eyes, like, I don't know, drawing a pupil or highlights, so she looks really empty here. Day 5, I drew someone wearing more revealing clothes to force me to properly drawing proportions and poses, which I think generally turned out pretty well, and I think the pants specifically look pretty decent as far as the shading goes. Unfortunately, her right shoulder almost looks dislocated, and her face looks both empty and completely disconnected stylistically from the rest of the piece. Day 6, I thought I'd do something kinda silly and draw Makima from Chainsaw Man because I had the idea to make her black tie and pants blend into the background to give the impression of their existence without explicitly rendering them. I think compositionally it's really cool. Just ignore her face because I really couldn't capture her likeness properly, and decided to just draw in my style and slap some cute glasses on her to distract from it a little bit, but that's fine. Day 7, 1 week into the challenge, I actually really like the general look and feel of this piece, although her eyes are kinda far apart and she almost looks like a sloth, but if you just pretend her face doesn't exist, the slightly low angle, I think, was communicated pretty decently. Also, even though the eyes are a bit far apart, I finally started drawing a pupil and highlights into them so they don't look so soulless. Day 8, I shifted away from the drop shadow approach and elected for a solid color background with a highlight around the characters to make them pop, and I actually really like how this pose came out, between the exaggeration of the asymmetry and the impression of folds on the shirt. That being said, her sweatpants are very unconfident, and I really messed up communicating the folds and shading there since my reference was wearing a very low contrast gray pair of pants. I actually like Day 9 a lot. While I definitely went too far in exaggerating the S-curve of the pose to the point that it kinda looks like she's thrusting out her pelvis, I like the general dynamism of the piece, and I was pretty happy to get the perspective on the guitar generally correct. Day 10, I'm not really huge on. While I appreciate the amount of character that I managed to pull off with the expression, I really struggle with sitting poses, so the lines are all very scratchy and unconfident, and it sort of falls apart the longer you look at it, so next, Day 11, it was a day. I like the pose in the reference because who the hell throws a baseball like this, but I also messed up the perspective on her back leg, which kind of makes it look like her weight isn't resting on it properly, which also just adversely affects the entire flow of the pose. I tried using a complementary color for the background, which I thought would look kind of cool, but at the end of the day I'm not really a huge fan of it, so I went back to my previous strategy afterward. For Day 12, I drew another picture of the girl with the guitar from Day 9. This time, I don't really have any complaints with the pose or perspective, both of which I think turned out pretty well, especially the interlaced hands. Unfortunately, I tried to capture her likeness more here, with rounded features compared to the sharper features on my previous rendition of her character, but I think I pushed it a little too far, and she ends up lacking definition and ultimately looks flat. Also, her right foot's perspective is pretty bad, so let's just ignore that. Day 13, I think I like and dislike in equal parts. The pose is cool, and I think I exaggerated the asymmetry just enough to where it looks dynamic while not looking silly. That being said, her head and neck are not proportional to the rest of her body, and it looks more uncanny the longer that you look at it as a result, especially since my previous stylistic choices have often featured heads that are very slightly larger than on the regular human body. Day 14, I was starting to realize that I was forgetting how to draw profile views, and I think I did so here pretty successfully. But her accessories are super unconfident since they have varying levels of transparency in the reference photo and also overlap. Also, the hands. Jesus Christ. They're not only kinda disproportional, but generally even the silhouettes and even the fingers are really mangled looking. So, Day 15 requires some context. I usually draw in Procreate on my iPad, and this one was done on Clip Studio since I got a screen tablet and wanted to try it out. So not only was I out of my element in a general sense due to drawing on new software on a new tablet, I'm also drawing a man, the second one I've done in this challenge. It looks bad. His right arm is as long as Kermit the Frog's, and the baby face is so real because I only know how to draw women, and not very well at that. Definitely not the halfway mark that I was looking for, but I promise that I have a return to form, mostly since I just went back to my iPad and Procreate. Honestly, I'm a pretty big fan of Day 16's piece. This was a super dynamic pose and was neither a standing or a sitting pose, so being able to draw it properly and communicate the shapes that contribute to the flow of everything, I was pretty happy. With that though, I can't draw backgrounds to save my life, and she was lying in a tube, so I try to just slap some cylindrical impressions of shapes and some contact shadows to sort of ground her in the piece, to middling success. Day 17, there's a lot to like when it comes to everything but the face. The pose is cute, the flow in the clothes looks good, and the brief shading I've laid down gives it a pretty decent sense of form. Unfortunately, her face is not only really flat and uncanny looking, but it's also not centered properly on her face, which is kinda a really big issue. Day 18 though, I felt pretty good about. There are some flaws, like the girl on the left having a more masculine face shape, and the slightly different stylization on her eyes because I was struggling with the perspective, but I think overall the piece turned out pretty nice. The profile view on the person on the right looks great in my opinion, but the hair's a little iffy. The girl on the left fits well within the scene, and overall I feel like it looks pretty cohesive. I decided to make the background solid finally, with a different color than the line art, and I think that it grounds the character in the scene much more than my old strategy of highlighting the characters. Also, I finally stopped just making really poor attempts at hatch lines to communicate when something like an article of clothing or hair was a darker shade, and just decided to use my fill tool at a lower opacity, which you'll see definitely helps in establishing contrast in my future sketches. For day 19, I think the pose was done relatively well given how I, as you've seen, struggle with sitting poses. I was really happy to be able to get that down properly, although her right leg is definitely a little bit longer than her left. And I also messed up the tangent between the legs, making her shoe almost look like it comes from her right leg rather than her left, which makes it look even longer. Also, the clothing folds on her left arm kinda don't convey her wrist bending too well, and almost making it look like her arm is just short. Day 20. Yeah, I'm not happy with this one. The shape language is very unconfident, and she looks really round, when I generally like a lot of my things to be a bit sharper and more striking. And my shading didn't really convey the flow of the clothes that contribute to that roundness overall, so she looks exclusively round and wide. We'll just pretend this one doesn't exist. Day 21 I'm pretty happy with. It's fun, the pose is generally done well I think, and although her left shoe is a bit large and her right shoulder is trying to run across the globe, if you can ignore those then I think it's pretty alright looking. The face, and day 20's too, are pretty flat and uninteresting looking, which is kinda frustrating. Day 22, her head feels a lot bigger than it should be. Also, the reference picture that I used had a stiff pose, and I feel like that transfers over to a drawing that looks unintentionally stiff rather than being accurate to the reference. That being said, I think the flow on the shirt looks really nice, and rather than shading the hair, I gave the impression of form and shading with lines that follow the hair's direction. Something that I kinda forget about for a few days before re-employing. Day 23, I remember being pretty busy and not having too much time. This, combined with the reference photo generally being somewhat low contrast because of the all-black outfit and harsh lighting, made it so that the overall finished sketch comes across pretty flat. The face too, I couldn't accurately capture the cool, distant gaze of the original, so I instead had to settle for an almost confrontational, yet, I hope, still pretty cool look. I kinda like day 24's. Sure, it feels like somewhat of a retread from my previous profile drawing, although the pose is a lot more involved. The head's tilting at an angle, and I made sure that the flow of the clothing was a lot more clearly defined. Also, I started to use gradient backgrounds, which I think look a lot better than just a flat color and, in this case, helps communicate the light motivation. That being said, even though her head is tilted up, I really struggled to get the angle of the face properly, since it's looking up and cocked to the sides, so I worry that it overall looks slightly more flat than I probably could have made it. Day 25, my complaints are actually fairly minimal. While it's not the best thing I've done, the clothes have a really nice flow, the shape language comes across much more confidently, and I'm gonna give myself a pat on the back for drawing the hand pretty well by my standards. That being said, the face always looked off to me in this one, and it wasn't until I looked back at it with fresher eyes that I realized that her bangs are off-center, which makes the face and her hair at odds with each other in terms of perspective, and overall gives it a unnatural and uncanny sort of feeling. One more thing that I like is my decision to choose a different color for the background gradient from the sketch, which makes the character still anchored in the piece while also allowing for it to pop out. Closing in on the last week or two of the challenge, I actually started feeling a lot more comfortable, and I think it kinda shows in these last 5 pieces, for better and for worse. On day 26, I finally started to make full use of the hair quote-unquote shading by just giving the impression of highlights through negative space, and I think it looks much better than whatever I was doing in the past. Additionally, the pose and clothing flow, I think, both come together really nicely, and if you just quickly glance at it, I think it came out pretty well. Just, you know, ignore how big her right hand is. I messed up the downward tilt of her face from the reference photo, and placed it more parallel with the horizon line, which meant that I inadvertently made her hand bigger to still meet her lips. But other than that, I really like this piece. Day 27, I finally gave the dreaded portrait drawing another shot, since, as you can see, I've kind of always struggled with faces. I actually really like how the face came out in this one, and I think that I generally shaded according to the planes of the face pretty well here to make a stylized face that doesn't end up looking flat, something I've struggled with since I initially started with an anime style. That being said, I really struggled with the clothes on this one, especially since the reference was low quality and had a lot of almost pure black areas, meaning that there was a lot of ambiguity in the shapes for me. So the face looks good, but if you decide to look at the clothes, I kinda recommend squinting a little bit. Day 28, I'm not happy with either. The pose is cute, the proportions are proper, and overall I'm pretty happy with that portion of the piece. The face, though, looks really flat, and she kinda looks like a frog because of the mouth. Also, her features are generally a bit too high and her hair isn't very voluminous, which makes her face look even more improperly placed. Without the face though, I think it looks pretty alright. Day 29, I think, is a piece worth celebrating for me. Second to last day, and I think I did pretty damn well by my own standards. While the pose isn't very dynamic, I think I still communicated a nice flow with the character, which makes the piece look very full without being stiff. The gradient being applied to the character too also places her within the scene, more so than any of my previous attempts, and I finally managed to draw an open mouth from a profile view, something that I desperately avoided in every other profile view face that I did. Also, I think it just kinda turned out pretty cute. I love the reference photo, so I'm really happy that I could communicate the gothic vibes of it, especially with the shading and makeup on her face. For the final day, day number 30, I'm pretty satisfied. While I don't think it's quite as good as day 29's, which is probably where I peaked, I do think that I managed to sort of employ everything that I learned so far. The clothing has a decent flow, although it lacks definition. The pose is pretty exaggerated, and it was challenging to draw. And the face here looks pretty well constructed while maintaining my stylization. If anything, here, I wish that I communicated highlights in the piece rather than just shadows, but that's something I can change pretty easily if I ever decide to do anything with it. Overall though, looking back from day 1 to the last few days that I'm actually proud of, I think there's been a pretty noticeable improvement, not only in how I found myself regarding my stylization, just in general body and shape language. So if you've made it this far, thank you. I feel like I've made a lot of progress when I compared days 1 and 2 to things like day 29 and 27. I think I've gotten a lot more comfortable drawing faces, drawing poses, communicating the flow of clothing, shading faces, almost everything that I repeatedly attempt to do in this challenge. I believe that there was genuine growth and improvement. As you're seeing here, these are just time lapses of drawings that I did after the challenge, something that I've essentially just kept myself doing. I've maintained my daily art for the past 5 or so days, despite the challenge being over, and you're seeing the fruits of that labor here as the time-lapse plays, where you'll eventually see the finished piece. But that leaves the question, is this something that I recommend? And the truth is, honestly, do not do this if you just want to improve. This is such an inefficient way to do things if you don't have the fundamentals down. My friend, who's also learning art, learned how to realistically render shadows and clothing folds in like 2 weeks while I drew 14 pretty mediocre sketches. Now, I definitely improved, but I think he improved much faster. I didn't target any one thing to learn, whether that be anatomy, facial structure, or even shadows. Instead, I did a bit of anatomy here, a bit of facial structure there, and some shadows everywhere. If you're aiming to improve by doing this, look somewhere else. That being said, I do recommend drawing every day. Something like 30 minutes of gesture drawing if you want to learn anatomy and proportions, or studies of facial structures that could consist of quick drawings of people's faces by reference. These are all exercises that, when done with consistency and repetition, will help you improve much faster than anything I did. But more than that, and most importantly with me, this is something I do for fun. Art's something that you should have fun when doing. I don't know if I have the motivation to draw random gesture drawings for 30 minutes. I don't know if I can keep drawing the same basic face from 10 different angles every day. But I do know that I have it in me to create a sketch every day that I can look back on and be proud of and maybe even render in the future. Improving little by little even if that's not the most efficient. Because at the end of the day, I want to have fun with my hobbies. Maybe it would be more fun if I could do it quicker because I studied more intensely, but I don't want to give myself an aversion to art. I want to have fun, and I'd imagine that the people who do art want to have fun expressing themselves too. If there are any takeaways from this video, I hope that it's these. 1. Acknowledge what you need to improve on, but also acknowledge what you're doing well. With each of my pieces, no matter how mediocre, I always try to find something that I can walk away with the feeling of, that's something I think I can see improvement in. 2. Be consistent. Even if you're doing gesture drawings or making a sketch like me every day, try to find time as often as possible to just practice, and more than that, practice with an objective in mind or a purpose. I still struggle with the latter, but each of the pieces that I selected, I had something in mind that I knew would be challenging to me and was something I wanted to be able to conquer. Lastly, and most importantly, have fun. Even if you're like me and you're not great at art, it's a form of self-expression that's meant to be enjoyable. I enjoyed a good 99% of making these, and seeing the day-by-day improvement, no matter how small, always felt great. Thanks for watching the video. I hope that, just maybe, this inspired you to try and get out there with art, to be more consistent, to be less self-deprecating, and, most importantly, to enjoy yourself. My uploads are pretty inconsistent, but I put everything I have into each of them. If you want to check out my other longer form content, I have a playlist here and would love to see you subscribe and stick around. Thanks.